8:30 service at Manchaca United Methodist Church here on Facebook Live. I'm David McNitzky, one of the pastors, and I'm pleased to be with you this morning. I would remind you, lots of things going on for worship and edification today. If you come back with us at 9:30 and have children, you can join in Miss Kim's children's time. If you're part of an adult Sunday school class, you'll have an adult. You can find Sunday school classes meeting online as well. And then at 11 o'clock, our Life on the Road service will be here also on Facebook Live. If you miss any of this, you can always go to the YouTube channel and catch us there as well. But the fun continues here, but in live and in person for our youth group at 5:30 this afternoon. They'll be joining together to play putt-putt golf. Also during the week, we have Bible studies. You find in our newsletter or on our website information about those Bible studies. And this Friday night, an activity by Zoom for all of us, and that is our first trivia night. And so I hope you'll consider joining us for that this Friday evening. And then in a fairly quick turnaround, I hope you'll also consider joining our youth group on Saturday morning for cleanup day. And I don't know if that'll be more difficult than trivia, but I do know this, there will be tacos. My wife and I are in charge of that, and we'll make sure that you are fed at that occasion. And then on the 26th, the following Friday, the first of our family fun activities. So lots of ways that you can connect both online and in person here at the church. And I'm so glad that you've joined us for this opportunity to connect today. I also want to remind you that last week we began talking about the subject of friendship. And our theme is we are better together. And the verse that we're using is 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7. We're reminded by Paul that love always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. So we'll look at trust and friendship today. As you look at it together, I hope that you will find on the screen the call to worship. You get underlined parts. Would you join me as we worship God together? Over the turbulent waves in our lives, Jesus calls us. We get so busy watching the waves, we block out Jesus' call. Look again. Jesus is calling you. Lord, help us hear your voice. Come, place your trust in Jesus. What a friend we have, Jesus. That's our hymn as we open this morning.
This past year, our preschool teachers were Susanna Dunlap, Diane Ewing, Ellen Sterling, and Becky Sturgill. Gothic play teachers for kinder and second grade were Loretta Lloyd and Courtney Brock. Jenny Reinhardt and Susan Feldkamp led our third graders in how to read their Bibles. Tommy Norman and Ron and Linda Hawkins were our faithful fourth and fifth grade teachers. Middle school was led by the brave Rick Bowman and Aaron Legato, and Ron Weiss partnered with our youth director Mike to teach high school. Lord, we thank you for this teaching team's dedicated service. We thank you for calling them into ministry and for the gifts and talents that you gave them to equip them for the task. We thank you for our children and our youth and ask your blessings upon them as they continue to grow in faith. May we all use our gifts and talents to your glory. Amen. Now, church prayer concerns and celebrations do you have? Please let us know in the comments and or private message us if you have a private concern.
Let us pray. Ever faithful God, life seems to get crazy sometimes. We love the smooth times when all is well. But, oh Lord, we have serious problems with wind and waves. We want you to fill our sails with a lovely breeze that guides our little boats across the placid sea. But you know that life isn't just glassy seas and gentle breezes. Sometimes things get rough. Help us place our trust in you during these rough times. You call to us to reach out, and take our focus off our own heading, and place our trust in your love. Then you ask us to reach out to others with the same kind of love and compassion that you have given to us. Today we have come to you with our burdens and cares. Our seas are not calm, but you offer to us the lifeline. Be with us, guide our lives, give us courage and hope, strengthen us to truly be your disciples. This we pray in the name of Jesus, remembering the words he taught his disciples to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
We are talking in the month of June about the real reality that we are, in fact, better together as friends in service to God and in service to other people. We thought together about an overarching theme verse, 1 Corinthians 13, that love always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. But we also each Sunday are looking for another Bible story under Paul's umbrella to teach us about friendship, and today's story to teach us comes from Matthew, the 14th chapter, beginning in verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they cried, as they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Lord, if it is you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. These summer warmer temperatures remind me of cooler times in my life. And I couldn't help but think this week of a time almost 30 years ago when we took the youth from our church on a mission trip to Colorado. But we had sort of a play day built in between the mission days. And so on this particular play day, almost 30 years ago, we went to a reservoir, or a lake, and all the youth got to swim. And they were way off from the shore, swimming and frolicking and having a great time. And they invited me to swim out to join them. And so I did, with some difficulty, because I'm not a great swimmer and the altitude makes a difference. But I got closer to them. Finally, I got with them and played for just a few minutes, and then I was out of gas. And I still had to get all the way back to the shore. And so, as I was in the middle, caught between the shore and the youth group, I thought for a brief moment that maybe I was going to drown. And when that was happening, there were some thoughts that were going through my head. The first one was this: why can't my youth just play putt-putt like other youth groups? Actually, that wasn't the thought I had. The thought I had is, what am I doing here? And the realization was, I'm here because I'm stupid. I'm here because I'm arrogant. I'm here because I didn't realize that I'm not 16 anymore. But really, that wasn't the main thing. I was here because that group of 14, 15, and 16-year-olds out in the middle of the lake had called me and asked me to come and join them. And so I did. I went not because of some hubris on my part, but I went because of the kinship I had with them and the trust I had with them that if they could do it and they invited me, then I could do it as well. And so that's really what I was doing in the middle of all of those waves beginning to come over my head. I tell you this because I'm wondering if Peter had the same sensation as he looked at the waves and began to sink. I wonder if he thought, what am I doing here? And maybe his first answer is, it was my pride, it was my hubris, it was my stupidity, whatever made me think I could walk on the water. But the reality is, in Jesus' day, disciples were not students who sat studiously writing down every word that a master said so they could learn it here. Disciples actually were people who watched keenly every move of the master, of the rabbi, so they could reenact it and do it in their own life. And so Peter observes that Jesus can walk on the water, so he knows that that is expected of him as a disciple. So he's there, but it's not because of hubris. It is also because of trust. Just as those kids in the reservoir called me out to them, so Jesus called Peter out of the boat into the water. Friends, I tell you this story today because we find ourselves out in the water and we find a storm around us. And at this moment, it is good to remember that Jesus is a friend. And we need to think about that together. You see, I'm not the first who've said it, that we are facing twin crises, if not more, the crises of COVID-19, the crises of beginning to perhaps realize for the first time in a while or in a deeper way the inequities and the racism against blacks in our society, and that's a crisis. But you need to know we're not the first people that have been in crises. Disciples always find themselves in crises. Disciples of Jesus through the years have been involved in wars. They've been involved in plagues. They've been captured and dispersed and relocated and persecuted. They often find themselves in the midst of crises. In fact, in the early churches, they actually had a symbol for the church. It was a boat on the middle of a stormy sea with a cross in the middle of the boat as a way to remind themselves that the early church, they felt like they were like a boat in the midst of the sea that was stormy and that Jesus was with them. So here we are in the storms that we face today. And it's good to know this story that Jesus comes walking toward us on the water. But earlier in Matthew, there's an interesting story about the disciples and Jesus being on a boat together, and Jesus' response is that he calms the sea and he calms the storm. But in this story, he calls them out of the boat into the storm. I think this is an important decision point for Christians all over America. Do we worship a Jesus who simply wants to calm us down, calm our fears, get us back to normal as soon as possible, and soothe everything, which Jesus can't do? Or are we worshiping a Jesus who's calling us out of the boat into the storm and into the waves? If that is the Jesus who is with us today, I would like to share with you a few observations about Jesus as our friend in the middle of the storm. And the first observation I'd share with you is this. My experience of Jesus is he's always outside the boat. He's always outside of my comfort zone. He's always asking me to get to the edge. He's always inviting me, in a sense, out on the water. I've heard discussion this week that having hard conversations and hard looks at ourselves, the kind that many of us are having at this point in our life, or especially around racism, is actually a spiritual discipline. It's called the spiritual discipline of discomfort. That it is good and right and appropriate at times that we're discomforted by our faith and our life and by the world around us. That's a Jesus who's calling us out of the boat. We worship a Jesus whose main goal in life is not our safety, but whose main goal in life may be our growth as human beings, our growth as disciples, and our contributions to building a better society and building a better world. I thought about what Pastor Jason said when we were talking about this text a couple weeks ago. He said, when Peter's out on the water and starts to have trouble, he can either reach to try to get back to the boat, or he can reach to Jesus. And I think each of us finds that situation in our life. Do we reach to try to go back to what we knew, or do we go ahead to what could yet be, because that's where Jesus is? One commentator put it this way years ago. He said, boats are perfectly safe in the harbor, but that's not what they're meant. That's not where they're meant to be. And in the same way, we're meant to be out in the storms of the world, because that's just where Jesus hangs out. Another thing I would tell you is if Jesus is calling us out into the storms of the world, he can be trusted to help us in the midst of the storms. Peter, in fact, does walk on water. We can find that the Jesus who calls us out of the boat will sustain us when we get out of the boat. I think about the number of times Jesus has called me out of a boat. Kim honored and prayed for the teachers this morning. And I remember the first time my church where I was pastor said, Pastor, we don't have a leader for, and they named a particular age group that terrified me. And I started doing an after-school program for those children, and I was way over my head. And they ran roughshod over me for weeks, if not months on end in the first semester. But Jesus sustained me. I remember the time Jesus called me out of the sidelines as a pastor into leadership as a pastor, working with other pastors. And that was scary to assume I might have something to give to somebody else and then be held accountable for what I might give them. But Jesus called me out of that boat. And I remember when he called me out of the boat of control into the boat of trust. Instead of trying to arrange everything in my church, to begin to let things flow and trust other people that the Holy Spirit was working within them. But each time he called me out of the boat, he supplied me. And each time he called me out of the boat and supplied me, he also gave me friends to be there where he wanted me to be. When I think about the uncomfortable conversations I'm having with myself and others around race, I remember how I first got in more deeply into these conversations in 2014. They were because my wife was beginning to have those conversations. And I remember how I went further along. It's because my son was a graduate student at Duke, and some of you know I learned so much by reading, and he started piling books on for me to read about the experience of the oppressed from their point of view. I had friends out on the water with Jesus. And I would tell you, Jesus is normally out on the water, but he can be trusted to support you on the water. But it doesn't mean it's a slam dunk. Look what happened to Peter. He starts to walk. He looks at the waves, the wind, feels the wind, he begins to sink. And it's been rightly said that we will sink if we take our eyes off Jesus and put more focus on the problem than on the resource. If we look more at what we don't yet have than what we and who we already have. And I think that's true. But there's another little twist to the story. If you remember what I shared with you some minutes ago, that the goal of a disciple was always to be like the rabbi, so you could do what the rabbi does, not just know what the rabbi knows. Then if the goal is that Peter should walk on the water like Jesus, and Jesus intends that for Peter, and Peter begins to not believe it, who is Peter doubting exactly? Is it Jesus? Probably. But is he also doubting himself? Does he doubt that God has given him the capacity and the Spirit to do the things that Jesus did? Maybe the one Peter eventually doubts in this story when he begins to sink is himself and the call of Jesus on his life. Susan Jeffers wrote a great book on fear called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway some years ago. But she said at bottom, underneath most all of our fears is the belief, I can't handle it. And we get afraid. Whatever this is, I can't handle it. And I wonder if that's finally where Peter got. I can't handle this now. And the truth of the matter is, if Jesus calls you out of the boat, you can handle it. The problem is bigger perhaps than you, or you and me together, or even a number of us together. But we can do something. Jesus can be trusted. And we can be trusted to do something about our issues. Finally, let me point this out. I think what's fascinating is that Peter gets knocked for walking and then beginning to sink. But what about the other 11 still on the boat? Commentators have rightly observed that when Jesus and Peter got back in the boat, everybody fell down and worshiped Jesus. And one person put it this way, because one man got out of the boat and walked toward Jesus, 11 other people who were afraid to came to worship God and see God in a new way. When we take a risk, when we go out into that storm, there's a lift effect that blesses other people. There's a power in courage. There's a power in friendship that lifts everyone around it. I got a text message this week about something that happened in the African country of Burundi. It didn't make the news. It should have, but it didn't make the news here. It made the BBC International News. But the president of Burundi died several days ago. Burundi is one of the poorest nations in the world. It's the sister nation to Rwanda and had civil war just like Rwanda had civil war. But a number of years ago, in 2010, a friend of mine invited me to go with him on a mission trip to Burundi. I'd never been to Africa. I'd never been to a country just 3 years removed from civil war. I'd never been where I might not have electricity. There was so much not to know. There were so many storms on the horizon. But I knew my friend. He had been there, he had come back, and best of all, he was going to go with me and take me there. And from 2010 to 2017, I went on 7 different mission trips and came to love and learn from the great people of Burundi. And as a side note, many churches and orphans ended up being helped by our church as well. But it all started because one friend looked at me and asked me to get out of the boat. And because I trusted him, I did.
would invite you to join in our closing hymn, hymn number 462, if you have your own hymnal at home. And we'll be singing the first and third verses of "'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus." "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, and to take him at his word, just to rest upon his promise, and to know thus saith the Lord. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I've proved him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Yes, 'tis sweet to trust in Jesus, just from sin and self-disease, just from Jesus simply taking life and rest and joy and peace. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I've proved him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more.
Thank you for being with us this morning. You can find the Children's Time on Facebook Live at 9:30 with Miss Kim, and Life on the Road with Pastor Jason, and that will be at 11 o'clock this morning. I'm glad that you are with us, and thank you for your patience while we continue to worship at a distance from one another. As you know, this returning to church is a moving target as we pay attention to what the virus is doing in our community. So I invite your patience while we pray and safely wait that out together. Now, please receive this ancient benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Amen.